You're listening to the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, Ben Eagle. To listen to previous episodes, visit thinkingcountry.com or find the podcast on iTunes by searching for Meet the Farmers. Hello and welcome to episode 23 of Meet the Farmers, which is coming to you from Suffolk. And for the first time on the podcast, at long last I might say, we're putting the focus on pigs. Today's guest is Mark Hayward of Dingley Dell Pork. Dingley Dell was established in 1999 by Mark and his brother Paul on their farm near Woodbridge in the beautiful Deben Valley of Suffolk. Their aim was to produce superb tasting, welfare-friendly pork with impeccable provenance. Keep that in mind, guys, for later. Mark, thank you so much for speaking to me today.
It's a pleasure.
I made a mistake when I talked to you on the phone, first of all. I called you a pig producer, but you wouldn't necessarily call yourself that.
No, I suppose we we're hands-on with the pigs and we keep pigs, but we tend to think of ourselves as food producers, and that's what we focus on.
Can you give me a sort of brief family history of farm and how you first got involved and then how you took it forward?
Yeah, sure.
You and your brother took it.
Yeah, my father had indoor pigs and he had about 250 sows indoors, producing just normal sort of commodity pork. Yeah. I went away I did my A-levels. I wasn't sure I wanted to farm, but I've always been involved in, every weekend I was at work in the pigs, every summer holidays, but I wasn't entirely sure that I wanted to farm.
Yeah.
So I went to Australia for a bit, and when I was out there I decided actually I don't want to live in a city and I do want to farm. So I came back. I then went to work for a farmer in Yorkshire for about a year, a guy called Richard Lister, which was very good. I then went to college for about 6 months and then I came back on the family farm. So I got involved in the indoor pigs my father had, set up a small outdoor unit where we just had the sows outside, thoroughly enjoyed it, preferred it to our indoor system, which at the time wasn't in the greatest shape, so it wasn't the best indoor site, if you like. So the outdoor thing worked really well. That was at a time when the supermarkets were going to move towards more welfare-friendly meat and all of the welfare legislation came in. So it seemed quite logical to, move more of the pigs outside. As it happens, at and around that time, we got a disease problem called swine dysentery, which is pretty unpleasant. And we tried to eradicate it and couldn't. And in the end, all of the pigs we had to go. So we destocked both the indoor and the small outdoor, and then decided to come back with just an outdoor setup. So this would have been in my early 20s.
Okay.
So what happened then was we came back with an outdoor setup, and then that was at a time when the pig price crashed for around 10 years, and pig farmers were very upset that new welfare legislation had come in that basically made it illegal for us to produce like they did on the continent, but it was okay for the supermarkets to sell it. So anyway, pig farmers got quite militant, which we were involved in, and there was a lot of blockading of supermarket distribution centres, etc., right across the country. And so there was a period there where sort of half the pig industry went out of business. It was very militant. It was not good financially. At that time, I just wanted to farm pigs. So did Paul, wanted to try and find a way of making it work, and realised actually what we need to do is we need to be a more important part of the supply chain. So that's when we formed the brand, if you like.
That's when Dingley Dell began.
Yeah, and it began really as a way. Initially, that's how we gained some power in the supply chain. So our thought process was, right, if we have our own brand, if it gets sold in supermarkets, which is where we worked initially, if people buy it, if the supermarket makes their margin, what's the problem? So that was how the whole thing started. And at the time we said we would make it about animal welfare, taste, provenance, sustainability, if you like, and that's what we did, but it's a lot more sophisticated how we go about it now, obviously.
Where does the name come from?
I could give you the answer that it's a reference in Charles Dickens, which I'll sometimes use that if I wish to try and project a veneer of cultural sensitivity, but the reality is it was when I was at college. I had a very good friend, and if he had a few beers, then he would come out with this filthy rhyme about Dingley Dell pork, and it just kind of stuck. Or Dingley Dell it was about, and we needed a name when I set the first outdoor unit up. Needed a name for it for the management account, so we called it Dingley Dell. So that's the real one.
Can you describe your typical day? So we were speaking before we started recording of how you and so your brother is. There is an arable side of the business as well, which your brother tends to move more in those circles. You're moving more in the circles with the pigs, but you're both mucking in both sides. Yeah. What does a typical day look like for you?
Quite a bit of the time it will be on farm, maybe, I don't know, 5:30, 6:30 in the morning. So I might spend the morning on farm and then spend the afternoon in the office, or it could be, we could be having, most weeks we would have a bunch of chefs around, so again, they'd probably turn up for the afternoon. Every now and again there'll be export trips, so I'll be abroad for a few days. So it just depends on what's happening really, but it's lovely. It's a mix of being abroad, being in London, mucking around with meat, mucking around with chefs, or mucking around with livestock.
Yeah, and how does that compare to when you first started the brand, when I imagined that life was pretty hectic?
I don't think we ever envisaged we would get it to this point.
Yeah.
And I suppose, the joy of what we do now is we can take it in any direction we wish to take it now. It took a long time to get it right. It took years to get it sort of sorted. But now it's kind of sorted in a way that if we want to have a go at a new market, we can. If we want to try new products, or if we want to look at different ways of doing stuff, we can. So there's a lot of flexibility in what we do now that certainly wasn't there in the early days anyway.
Yeah. Tell me about the pigs. How many sows are in the herd?
We're running about 950 sows, which are all outdoors. We run our own nucleus and multiplication herds within that. So effectively, for what would generally happen would be a farmer would produce his crop or his livestock or his vegetable, and he would sell to a packer, and that would be his relationship with the market. He would be paid on a commodity price or a local price, the market price. He wouldn't be able to influence his price, so everything he did would be about throughput or speed of growth or getting my spuds bigger or whatever it was. So he'd be very, very much driven by trying to produce at the least cost because he couldn't control his output price. And he would buy, your normal pig farmer, he would probably buy in his females and his males for breeding. Those animals would have been selected and bred for speed of growth or numbers born, but basically traits designed for productivity. In our situation, we control our own and produce our own breeding animals. So because our focus is on taste first, if you like, the animals we're producing, which we will breed from, we are trying to influence for taste. So we're running a pure Duroc herd, and the Duroc has a higher level of marbling, and marbling is intramuscular fat. It's the little white lines you see running through meat. And basically, we work with a meat scientist. If you ask a meat scientist what is taste and flavour, or how do you get taste and flavour, they will say it is the intramuscular fat or the marbling in meat that constitutes flavour. So our whole breeding program is based around marbling. And so we have the pure Duroc herd where we know the marbling score of each individual animal. We're able to measure a live animal and assess its marbling. We're using software that was designed for the American beef industry. So we'll scan a live animal, we'll take photographs, we'll then put that data into the marbling program or the American software. That will then give the animal a score, and then what we will do consequently is we will breed most marbled to most marbled at nucleus level or great-grandparent level. So we will be making decisions, our breeding decisions, who we mate to who, will be based on marbling score. so that over time we are increasing the level of marbling in our pure Durox by about 15% year on year. So it's quite a complicated program, but if you just think about it in terms of all we've done is take the emphasis for selection off things like speed of growth, and we've put it on marbling. Mm-hmm. So we're running 950 sows. There's probably about 160, 170 pure Durox in there. The mother of the animal we process is a Duroc landrace, which we produce ourselves from our multiplication cross.
And you're crossing it with a large
We
white.
cross it back to a Duroc.
Crossing with the Duroc?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the animal we sell, we process is 75% Duroc.
Okay.
And our marbling program, we are affecting both the male and female parents, both lines, both sire and dam, we're working on at the same time.
Has that been your system from the early days of Dingley Dale?
No,
or have you
not at all.
Towards that?
Yeah, we've shifted more and more towards this kind of system. I mean, in our early days, when we talked about taste, we kind of took what research was on the internet. We did a few things for taste which were beneficial, but for the last probably 7 or 8 years, we've had a proper meat scientist involved, and their role is to look at not just what we do on farm in terms of lack of stress, but also how we feed them, how the chill chain works, handling at the abattoir. So basically what constitutes taste and what are the factors in the meat supply chain that we need to look at.
When you went through that process of moving towards that stage and working with Caroline Keeley?
Yeah.
Yeah, when you're working with Caroline, was there anyone else who you were looking at doing similar things to replicate, or was this innovative in its own right?
I think, to be fair, what happened was, we'd started exporting, or we were exporting to countries such as Hong Kong and Singapore, and you see a lot of Japanese Wagyu on sale. Yeah. And Japanese Wagyu is it's a specific type of beef. It's been bred for massively high levels of marbling, and it doesn't really taste like beef. Its price point's very high, and it's really quite an interesting and unique product in a lot of ways. And you just kind of look at it and you think, well, this is really interesting, because these guys are focusing on taste. You've kind of got two markets in the meat industry. You've got the sort of taste or welfare market, and then you've got your kind of everyday market where people are trying to produce meat to a price point, which I get, I understand that. But I think what you'll deliver as farmer is something that has got impeccable animal welfare credentials, but at the same time it's got to be something that tastes really well.
Let's turn towards that sales and marketing side. In the early days, how did you begin to build relationships with chefs?
Well, in the early days, we started with supermarkets, and I probably we did a local sausage with Tesco's, we did some work with Asda, we did a whole range into about 65 co-op stores. Yeah. So we did quite a lot in retail, and I spent hundreds of days cooking in store in simple recipes or cooking sausages, and that's how we tried to kind of get going in retail.
Yeah.
And about probably for the first year or two we focused on retail. In fact, interestingly enough, we had a professor of economics get involved in what we were doing, who kind of told us, right, you need to do retail, you need to do X, Y and Z, and in actual fact we did the complete opposite after a while of what he told us to do. But I think the thing was with retail was what we found quite difficult was, one, you are one product of many in a category, and we didn't really see that one coming at the start. So, you're delighted you've got a sausage in Tesco's, you go in there to have a look at it and it's one of 50, and you realise that actually it's not that quite straightforward. We spent a lot of time in supermarkets, particularly myself, cooking for members of the public, and it didn't do us any harm. Yeah. But I think, we got involved with one or two chefs locally, and we realised, well, actually, if we can convince the chef this is the pork he wants on his menu, it's job done. Yeah. We don't have to convince anybody else. Yeah. Obviously, the downside of that is a pork is one of many items on a menu, so the volume for an individual restaurant's not that big. Mm. But probably the loyalty factor's far greater, if you like. So we just fell into local chefs, and we fell into sort of a bit more distant. And fell into doing stuff in London, and then it came sort of a bit more nationwide, and then, obviously started doing a bit of export work.
How does it work in terms of distribution of product?
We have one or two partners we work with who have distribution within a certain area. For some of the bigger accounts we deal with, then they might be using a national distributor, or they might even be using one of the big distributors as say, a set of wheels. So logistics is always going to be the hardest part of trying to do this. But, with the right people, or if the right person wants it, you can generally solve it. But logistics is the absolute key.
You've been part of the RSPCA's Freedom Food Scheme for about 15 years or so.
I have.
For listeners who aren't aware of what that is, what does it involve?
Well, it was a scheme that was set up by the RSPCA, and the idea was, back in the early days when it was set up, that they would bring out a welfare labelling mark that you see on packaging, and that would mean that farm had been audited by the RSPCA or to a set of their standards. And the idea was that would be assurance to the public, and if the demand for the RSPCA products grew, then animals would be taken out of perhaps conventional farming and placed in that type of farming. So we've been involved with it for a long time, but the way we farm, we go well beyond their schemes. So we're trying to head towards more of a holistic approach to how we do stuff. So obviously we're going to provide the animals with animal welfare, but we're looking at how we commercially farm, if you like, if we how we run our business within the context of the environment. So how can we increase the biodiversity of different species in and around our farming practices? So I think we're going to a more holistic approach generally across the whole farm.
Yeah. With that environment aspect in mind, I had in front of me a leaflet for the 1 million bumblebees, 1 million bees project, which you're involved in. Tell me about that.
Well, we've always had, around our farm, we've got 6-metre margins or wildlife corridors around every single arable field. Our father, when he was alive, he was very much into conservation, so we grew up with a love of the countryside, songbirds, etc. And as a business, we've always planted a little bit of wildflowers here and there to feed pollinators, to feed bees. And then last year we decided, why don't we, when we move the pigs, so when we flip them onto grass, why don't we drill behind them and plant some, in fact last year it was Phacelia, which is a lavender type plant, beautiful blue plant. So we planted some real big tranches of the Phacelia. At the time we were working on a wildlife diary around the farm, so we hired a student for 1 day a week, and her job was to record all the different species on the farm. And we knew when we planted this Phacelia that it was going to feed bees. That was why we planted it. It's an issue with the number of bumblebees. We wanted to try and improve the number of bumblebees on the farm. Well, it worked phenomenally well. It just unbelievable. We planted about 10 hectares of Phacelia, which is 100,000 square metres. We planted it in a staggered fashion. So the idea was we'd plant it at different intervals. So when it came into bloom for, say, 6-7 weeks, that tranche would be in bloom, and then once that had died off, there would be another tranche. So the whole idea was to try and get Phacelia in bloom for as long as possible to sustain bumblebees over a longer period. Because do you want me to go into briefly the problem with the bumblebee?
Yeah, go for it.
The biggest problem with the bumblebee is they build up colonies of 200 or 300. At the end of the year, the only thing that survives is the queens. So the queens, solitary queens, they will go and hibernate over winter. They come out in spring. There's absolutely no issue. It's a single bee. She's flying around, plenty of food. There's, blossom in hedgerows. There's dogwood. There's plenty for her to eat. She will start building her colony up from around the beginning of June onwards. If you look at particularly the East Anglian countryside and most of the arable farming that goes on, there's very little standard crops grown that produce nectar. Well, there's hardly any. There's rape, but rape tends to be going out of flower early June. So the poor old bumblebee, as it's building its colony up, the amount of available food in the countryside gets less and less and less. So one of the issues the bee has is they starve. So the beekeepers call it, or the bee guys call it, the June gap. So the whole idea is to plant there's no point having loads of wildflowers in April because you're talking about solitary queens. What you want is a real slug of nectar available from early to mid-June, hopefully right the way through to the end of September. So that allows the bumblebees, they can build up their colonies, plenty of food, so nice big colonies. They'll produce, if there's plenty of food, they'll produce one tranche of queens halfway through. You might get two broods, if you like. So anyway, last year we planted lots of Phacelia. We recorded the number of bees on it, and we made up a simple metre square. And we found that on a hot day, you could have between 10 and 14 bumblebees per square metre on the Phacelia. We managed to retain between the 2nd of June, when the first Phacelia came out, and the end of September last year, we maintained a minimum of 2 hectares in bloom at any one time. So 20,000 square metres. At 10 bumblebees a metre, 200,000 bees. So if we had one tranche in bloom, minimum 200,000, we actually, at one stage, we had more than one tranche, and we estimated we had about 600,000 bees on farm. At the same time, while this was going on, we were showing around the chefs and the food service guys, and they absolutely loved it. And they totally understood the concept that if we, on our farm, or if the countryside wants to have more biodiversity or more species or a better ecosystem, it has to start with insects. If you get insects, you get birds, you get small mammals. So effectively, the idea of planting lots of wildflowers and attracting bees, it's a really sound principle. And the bee's the signature cuddly pollinator, if you like. You're obviously going to get butterflies, you're going to get everything. So we got a phenomenal response from the food service industry last year, and the whole Million Bees thing was this year. We said, right, we want to put a real stake in the ground over this. We're going to do this on a grand scale across the farm. Our main business partner is a guy called Martin Blackwell, who has a meat business called Direct Meats. He co-funded half of it.
Right. Dare I say, I was thinking on our farm, we've gone into a high-tier countryside stewardship agreement as of this year. I'm assuming that this is all outside natural jurisdiction.
We are involved in the countryside stewardship scheme and have been.
But
the Million Bees project, which is 35 hectares, is outside of it. Yeah. In fact, it's 12 times the amount of conservation, outside of the scheme we're involved in. Going into this year, we said, right, we want to have 1 million bumblebees on farm, because it was just awesome last year. The idea was this year, look, we'll do it in a bigger way, we'll try and get some publicity, and we'll try and get a conversation going in the meat industry or in agriculture about how do we farm and draw nature in rather than push nature out. Because you can walk into a field of wheat and you can drive around here for miles and there's very, very little available food for bumblebees, period, around the land in East Anglia.
Tell me about getting chefs onto farm, because you have an awful lot of chefs come onto your farm.
We do.
And it's a big part of what you do. When did that begin?
It began right early on, actually. With the first chefs we started working with, we realised that I suppose if you looked back over all the time I've been farming, and particularly when we first started Dingley Dell, there probably wasn't a lot of interest in going on farm and stuff. But a few years into it, the whole celebrity chef thing kicked off, and it became a lot more food programs on television. And I think the chef world became far more interested in, where does my food come from? And I think we kind of just, in some ways, we happened to be in the right place at the right time to tap into that. We started having a few chefs out. Not every chef we deal with comes out here, not by a long way, but a large number do. And that's been brilliant for us because those guys move jobs, they take us with them, they move abroad, they contact us. We've built up a lot of relationships over the years with a lot of different people. a lot of the guys that perhaps come out here when they're students, because we have a lot of colleges out, or they're young chefs, when they end up running a place of their own, they'll bring people out. And partly, I think, for a lot of these businesses, for them to take some of the guys out of the kitchen, show them around a farm, have some food, really understand the science and nature of producing food, it's a real win-win.
You export to 8 different countries now? 9 countries?
I think small volume to about 11.
11.
Yeah.
How much of a learning curve was it when you began developing that sort of idea?
Mistake.
If another food producer were to take the leap, what advice would you give them?
We eventually ended up doing a lot in London with a lot of top-end food businesses and chefs, if you like. And I got the opportunity, I'd not really travelled or anything, had my head down on farm, and I got the opportunity to go out to Shanghai with... it was a food show, a trade show, and I was sponsored to go out there just to have a look, or I had the opportunity to, and I went out there, and there were Tyrrell's crisps out there, and there was one or two other British brands that were showing it was a Shanghai food show, and they had a British section. And while I was out there, I chatted to a lot of these businesses, and I just thought, you know what, we should have a go at this. We could have a go at this. And it was probably not till about 18 months or a year later, it was quite a while, I went and did a food show in Hong Kong, desperately hoped that a distributor might be interested. I think when we got there, realised that actually, we were actually known in Hong Kong by some of the British chefs that were there, or they'd been familiar with our product in London. And that was the starting point. I think the biggest mistake we made was assuming that because of how we did stuff in the UK was how we should do stuff there. That was a massive mistake. And so now we're a bit more relaxed. If you look at a new market, we tend to sort of sit back and try and understand what they do, why they do it, rather than going in thinking we know how to do this. So yeah, big learning curve, but really interesting learning curve.
Should we move the conversation outside and have a look around?
Yeah, definitely.
Where are you sending for killing?
CK Meats, which is I.
Okay.
So it's about a 40-minute drive. They gassed them, which is why we sent them there, because I believe it's better than electricity.
Why dare I say?
Well, basically, the problem with most of the modern plants they build now, they put gas in, because if you stun a pig, you've got to tong it. And if you've got a guy who's tonging pigs all day, he's going to get tired and he's not going to get it right on every one. Whereas gas takes out the human element. When you electrocute a pig, you put a lot of force through it, and it can cause femurs to break, can cause arteries to burst. So I wouldn't say it's stressful on the animal, because I think it just knocks them out straight away, but it's quite stressful on the carcass.
Okay. What do you think public payments for public goods actually means?
Whenever government get involved in anything, it's prescriptive. And you can't be prescriptive. When it comes to the environment of farming, every farm is going to be different. Every farm is going to be suitable for certain types of wildlife. Every farm is going to be different. So having a prescriptive scheme is kind of wrong. Yeah. I don't think farmers should necessarily be held responsible for looking after the environment off their own back. I think the environment is society's problem. If we want as a society, it doesn't matter whether we're producing meat or plants. If we want to have a thriving planet, we need a thriving ecosystem. So we need pollinators, we need everything. If farmers are going to turn over a proportion of their land to do that, or to improve the habitat, then that's what needs to happen. But I think it needs to be collectively paid for in the price of food. It's not a significant cost to do that. To get a farmer to, say, take out his worst 5, 6, 7% of his land and create a wildlife habitat or grow some wild flowers or whatever, it's not going to be a significant cost, but it is society's cost.
Yeah. Would you describe yourself as a conservationist?
I'd like to think so. Yeah, probably not. Maybe as I become older, brought up to be like that, but we've done so much work around the farm the last couple of years, particularly focusing on bumblebees. It's been incredibly rewarding to see. It's been incredibly well received by our customers, and I feel you feed the bees, you feed your soul. This field we're driving past, nothing's going to live in that field, and that's quite sad, really. I mean, we have 4 years without bumblebees, so it's a big concern.
And obviously, the chefs are coming out to the farm and seeing the results for themselves. Is that story then translating to their consumers, their customers?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it's really only the last 2 years we've been really focusing on explaining that side of it. But it's such a simple, tangible thing for them to see. We'll walk them in a field of wheat that's ripe and say, well, have a look. What insects can you find? I can't find any, Mark. Well, that's the whole point. That crop is being grown to produce lots of wheat. You're not going to find anything in it. But, if we as farmers plant this, it will support huge amounts of pollinators. So they get it. It's very tangible for them. Or over the last 2 or 3 years, I've made a point of trying to chat to younger people, because that's my next generation of customers. And it seems to me that the 20, 30-year-olds are very interested in sustainability, not 100% sure necessarily how that is, what that is, how they enact it, but very interested in it, very interested in, the planet. And so I think something as simple as this regeneration of the land, if you like, it strikes a chord, and that's brilliant. This is the dry sows. So you can see, obviously you can see the pure Durocs, and there's the Duroc land races. And obviously you can see the clover, which like I said, about 40% of the grass was sown with clover. And obviously you can see there's this one big strip of pigs down here. So what would happen probably in the next month or two, we'll put all those pigs and huts on the grass and clover, and then we'll re-drill this with whatever So basically just trying to come up with that concept of, yes, we are going to use that bit of land to put our pigs on, but how can nature benefit from that bit of land in the interim period?
And you're not organic.
No.
But how does your operation differ to, say, a Soil Association certified producer?
Probably mainly we don't feed organic feed.
Yeah, but otherwise, in terms of welfare and everything else,
we would be fairly similar, I guess.
Yeah.
I haven't, to be fair, I haven't looked at organic standards for many years. I think the organic movement was great. It's a shame it wasn't a local food movement, if you like.
Yeah.
They got a great thing going, and the trouble with organic meat, it's very expensive, particularly if it's pork or chicken, because 60-70% of the animal's diet is cereals, or we have to feed them. So you start using organic cereals and you massively increase the cost of production. Obviously it's not as expensive to produce an organic carrot pro rata. So the organic thing, it does works well, but maybe those price points are a bit steep for a lot of restaurants.
So what's the future of your business?
Paul and I have got half a dozen children between us. They're all a bit too young to make any serious decisions, I guess. But certainly like to think that the whole Ding Dell project would be carried on somehow. I'm sure it will be. From my perspective and Paul's, I think we work hard, we're enjoying the ride. It's very, the kind of people we sell to and the kind of businesses we work with, they're top businesses. They're the kind of businesses that are always pushing themselves, particularly, make better meals or be a better chef. And working with those guys just spurs you on. It makes you want to do it better. It makes us want to do it better. So, the intellectual challenge, if you like, of what we're doing, just gets better and better from my perspective. I want to do more of the sustainability stuff. I really want to understand more and more about rebuilding ecosystems. I know my brother's very much the same. See what happens, really.
Dingley Mark Hayward speaking to me last month at Ashmore Hall Farm in Suffolk. At a time when farmers and food producers are being pushed to really up their game, Mark's business stands as a flagship and an example of what one can achieve. He reminded me a good deal of Paul Kelly's business down in Chelmsford producing turkeys for the Christmas market. Paul featured in episode 8 of the podcast. A reminder that you can catch up with all previous episodes at thinkingcountry.com and do follow the podcast on iTunes. I'd really appreciate that. I've been your host, Ben Eagle, and this has been Meet the Farmers. I look forward to you joining me next time.